Sony just announced the FX5, and as somebody who has absolutely no intention of buying this camera, both for budget reasons and feature reasons, as in I don't need most of the features it offers, but as somebody who really likes cameras and who has been an FX3 user for 5 years, this has been my main camera since 2021, I just kind of want to dive in and look at the specs a little bit, look at what this camera can do, but also my favorite thing of all, contextualize. I love contextualizing things and asking who the FX is this for? Who is this FX for? Who is the FX5 for? 3, 2, 1. I got that out of my system. Okay. So the FX5 is a new addition to Sony's FX lineup, which has had the FX3 in it since 2020. And you had the FX6, the FX9, and then now the FX5. Also the FX2. We're just checking off all the numbers. And so the first thing with the FX5 that I think is interesting is Sony is being very clear about who this camera is for, and that it is clearly not a replacement for the FX3 or the FX3A, which, is sort of a slightly upgraded version of the original FX3. It seems like every time in the past few years that a new camera comes out, the first question is this the FX3 killer? And especially in this case, definitely not, because it's like, are large French fries the medium French fry killer? It's like they're just sort of different things in the same lineup. So I wanted to look at a couple things here. This is B&H's overview that has a few of the main features. So here we go, the highlights of this camera. These are, in terms of features and specs, these are the things I want to talk about because they would actually make a difference to me. 3.2 open gate. So you finally have, open gate on a camera here. That's pretty cool from Sony, and it's 5K open gate. Basically what that means is you can use the entire sensor of the camera when you're recording. And that is beneficial for anybody who wants to reframe during editing, or if you want to film one thing that has multiple purposes, primarily horizontal and video at the same time. Obviously, for many years you can argue, well, just get a wider shot. I have a wide lens on my FX3 right here. Just use a super wide lens and it's easier to crop in horizontal like normal, or crop in vertical if you want to do vertical video as well. But open gate does just make that easier. And I do think that if Sony didn't add it in this camera, they would have opened the gates to just a mob of flaming pitchforks. So open gate is a really good, helpful thing to have. 16-bit XOCN recording is a thing. That's a thing that exists in that camera that I definitely know all about and have never not heard of before. From what I understand, this is basically the FX5's way of matching the Sony Burano, which the Sony Burano has a $25,000 MSRP. And what is the Venice? Can you buy the Venice? It's like 100. You should probably just get one. So again, this goes back to Sony being very clear about where they're positioning the FX5. Kind of like when the FX3 came out, it's positioned as sort of, the little sibling camera to the FX6 and the FX9. If you're using those bigger cinema cameras, but you want something smaller and more compact, there's the FX3. The FX5 seems to have that same relationship with higher-end cameras like the Burano, including all the formats that help build up that compatibility. So we do have triple base ISO of 800, 4000, and 12800 versus the FX3 and FX3A's 800, 12000. So basically you're adding 4000 in there. Base ISOs are helpful for getting really clean images. That's basically where the sensor is going to perform its best and things are going to look their best. And it's really nice having two of them. So if you have, the lowest base ISO, you're going to get clean image quality there. And then as you bump up, you get up into 10,000, 11,000 ISO, you might start introducing noise. And then as soon as you get, like on the FX3, as soon as you get to 12,800, boop, it suddenly cleans up again. And it's like now the sensor's second wind. And so adding another middle ground right in between those is pretty awesome. I say that as somebody who records in ISO 100 on my FX3 because I primarily am in an environment that I control the lighting, and when I use the base ISO, then I got to get ND filters, and it becomes a whole if you give a mouse a cookie situation, which is why the FX5 is not intended for me, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. We do have AI subject recognition and tracking. This is something that has been in Sony's cameras since, I think the ZV-E1 was the first one, and then my A7 V also has it. Basically, despite the AI hype, that just means really good subject recognition, really good tracking, and it does work really well. getting, into the Sony ecosystem back in 2021 when I got my A7S III, one of the primary reasons, the things I really wanted were full frame 4K with no overheating. I wanted really, really good autofocus, full HDMI out, and image stabilization. And at the time, no other cameras offered it but the A7S III. And the autofocus on the FX3, still really, really phenomenal. But the AI autofocus that Sony's been adding in recently is even better, and it really does make a huge difference. You've got expanded monitoring options, a compact body, so they're going again with the FX style body, although it is a little bit different. We're going to look at some photos to kind of show that there. You have 32-bit float XLR top handle. 32-bit float is a really good thing, and if you have the option to have it or not have it, you might as well just choose to have it. But also, I don't think it's a selling point, and I think that there are, I don't know, we'll talk about it when we look at some photos and see how they implemented it. But the thing I'm hella jealous about is the removable tilting EVF. This is something, oh my gosh. Do they have a photo of it here? Yes. See this viewfinder right here? The camera now has a flip screen. There's a viewfinder, so no top handle in this configuration, but a viewfinder, and then you can just swap that out. This is something that Blackmagic has had for their pocket cameras for years, and it's just absolutely fantastic to be able to just add on the EVF when you need it, remove it when you don't need it. It's something that I've wanted for the FX3 since it came out, and I was like pretty sure Sony was going to do it because it just makes so much sense, and they never did. And so my first thought when I saw this was, oh my God, can I just get that for my camera? And the answer is no. And when we look at the actual product images, I'll show you why. But B&H does have a nifty comparison chart, the nifty comparison chart for the FX5 and the FX3A. So you can see these are kind of the key things. The sensor, 16 versus 12 megapixels. As has been the case since the A7S III, you're not going for the highest resolution. You're going for what works for video. And the FX5 specifically is a video camera. The FX3, you could argue, is a video camera, but it does have dedicated photo modes. The FX5 just said, nope, we're not doing that. We're just a video camera. The FX3 and the A7S III, when those came out, Sony was saying 12 megapixels is perfect for 4K video. So it makes sense then that we're using now a 5K camera that also does have open gate, so we're using more of the sensor. So we need a little bit more resolution, but it's still ideal for video applications. We have the processors and stuff. Yeah, there you go. And we have sort of these internal recording rates. Maximum of the FX5, pretty crazy. You can do 4K 240, 4.5K 120, and 5K 60, whereas on the FX3A, you can go up to 4K 120, which I use in almost every single video. I was actually able to sell my gimbals, and I don't think I've busted out a slider in many years because 4K 120 just makes it super easy to do, handheld shots that kind of look like they're on a gimbal or a slider. And especially for me as someone who does a lot of product B-roll and the things that are inanimate objects, it helps the workflow a lot. I don't know that I would ever need like 240 for what I do, so 120 is fine, but it'd be really fun to play with. We've got the file format, so everything you'd expect plus that additional XOCN. I have no idea if I'm even saying that correctly because that is for workflows way more professional than mine. The base ISOs and the LCD monitor gets an improvement. Yes, oh my gosh. Let me tell you, I can't tell you how much I love. Let me tell you, I can't tell you how much I love my FX3. But from the day I got it and the A7S III, the flip screen has been definitely a point of confusion. I'm actually filming this, ironically enough, on my Canon EOS R, which is not even, it's kind of a 4K camera, but this is actually just the 1080 signal from it. This camera from 2018 has a way better LCD display than the A7S III FX3. And that was baffling because it's a fraction of the price even when it was new compared to these cameras. And I had actually even read a thing, I don't know how true this is, read it on the internet, it must be true, that way back when Sony had purchased, I think it was from Samsung, they had just purchased like a ton of, little 3-inch LCD panels, and they just needed to get through the stock of them. So they were just putting them in everything, which is why when you buy your $4,000 FX3 and you turn it on, you're like, hey, this screen is small and like not super color accurate and kind of low resolution. That's weird. It really made no sense. They upgraded it on the FX3A, and now for a number of years, Sony's screens have gotten a lot better. And like on the FX5, on the A7 here, they have these crazy transformer screens that can do all this cool stuff, which is which are really, really fun. So I'm definitely glad to see an improved LCD display there, and it is a little bit heavier than the FX3. It's a little bit bigger. Again, we'll look at Sony's official product photos for that there. We have XLR handle. Talk about that in a second, optional EVF. So there's kind of the highlights there. I did want to hop over to Sony's product page so we can look at their official product photos. But before that, I do want to jump into, if you don't remember the history of the FX3, or you just weren't like in the Sony ecosystem or even in the world of cameras at the time, I think it's worth looking back on that when talking about the FX5, because it's so easy to get, caught up in the world of specs and stuff. But if we go back to 2020, who doesn't want to go back to 2020? And we look at the release of the A7S III, this camera was an absolute game changer. This was the one that kind of everybody was looking for at the time. All those things I mentioned: 4K, full frame, no overheating, full size HDMI out, articulating display, like all of these things that we kind of do take for granted now on cameras. This is the only camera that had all of that in, one package that actually worked. And so a bunch of people who were already Sony users were really looking forward to the A7S III. And then for others like myself, it was the camera that pulled them over from other ecosystems. In my case, Canon. I had 2 Canon EOS Rs. I'd used Canon forever, and I was even on the R5 pre-order when they announced it. But as soon as the A7S III was announced, I canceled that pre-order because it just seemed like the R5 wasn't... Sony had paid their dues at the time with mirrorless cameras, and Canon was still needing to catch up a little bit. They needed to muster the courage to catch up. And so I relished the fact that I could just get the A7S III in the meantime. But obviously changing camera systems is a huge pain in the butt. And, it's not something you want to just do randomly every time a new model comes out that you want to, I'll use that feature and that feature, because it is such a pain. I got my A7S III, and it really took me personally a couple of months to kind of get used to it. And then I was really seeing, wow, this camera is letting me do stuff that I genuinely cannot do with my Canon cameras. I can't do it with my Canon cameras. And having used a dual camera workflow, especially 2 of the same cameras with my EOS Rs, I love that. 2021 was also the year that YouTube became my full-time job. So as scary as it was to make any kind of big purchases as a newly self-employed person, it seemed like a worthwhile investment to get a second A7S III, so that way I could have that dual camera workflow. But again, if you go back to, at this point, it was 2021, there was a crazy chip shortage, very unlike today, where things were expensive and unavailable. And so, there were no A7S IIIs around. And literally, I'm not kidding at the time, this sounds like an exaggeration. This FX3, I got it from, is it Full Compass? A store in Chicago. It was the only FX3 or A7S III available online in North America. It was crazy. And so, even though I had originally wanted the A7S III to have dual cameras, at the time, if you remember, the FX3 was essentially just the A7S III in a different body, so image quality is exactly the same. And I was like, that's what I can get. It looks good. I'll just get that. And then this quickly became my main camera. So obviously the natural next thing to talk about here is a 30-year-old episode of King of the Hill, because I think that the FX3 relates to Hank's new truck in a lot of ways. So the A7S III was announced in the summer of 2020, and then a few months later, Sony announced the FX3, and that's when a bunch of people were like, that's so stupid, it's this weird square camera that it's just the A7S III in a different body, and you don't even have a viewfinder. Who wants that? And it's more expensive. Oof, Sony's dead, Sony's cooked, switching back to Canon. It might be kind of tough to remember the disdain for the FX3 and confusion about the FX3 when it was announced. In this old episode of King of the Hill, it is where Hank has his old red pickup truck that is it's not working anymore. And so he needs to get a new truck. He's very reluctant. And there's a whole series of events that lead to Bobby running away after they have a disagreement. And so Hank takes a new truck on a test drive to go find Bobby, and he has to search for him in the rain and all this stuff. And as he's using the truck, it kind of keeps proving itself to him. He's trying to find out where to go around town. It has a built-in compass, which, keep in mind, we're talking about 1997.
Anti-lock brakes. That's why they didn't lock.
It seemed like this confusing camera. It seemed like something you didn't really need, but then if you got it and you used it, whether you owned it or you were just using it like through work or renting it or whatever, it just kind of kept proving itself over and over again to the point where you saw it increase in popularity. It kind of became a standard. For the past 6 years now has been a pretty like incredibly common camera for not just home and solo creators like me, which you could argue it's overkill for, but for, production crews, events crews, filmmaking, like broadcast stuff, sports, like these cameras are everywhere. And then Sony expand on that lineup with the FX2, the FX30, like it really, this small form factor cinema camera really had a big market. And even you can see that with Canon's cameras, right? Suddenly Canon and other companies are coming out with, what are essentially their own versions of the FX3. And so as we jump into the FX5, you see a lot of it is just taking from the FX3 and then building on it, modernizing it, and then expanding it for kind of a higher end workflow. And this is a camera to me that sits right in that middle point of it's for like independent filmmakers, people who run their own production company, do a lot of client work, home and solo creators. Again, you could argue that this is overkill for what I do, but it is my main camera and has been for 5 years. So I've used it for thousands of hours of video, and it has just been, it's my favorite camera. I love it so much. And you can use it in more pro workflows, and you can use it in, more consumer friendly workflows. The FX5 kind of similarly can be used in, consumery workflows, but especially with the price and then the added features and, the added compatibility to those higher end cameras. I really do feel that Sony is, it's pushing it towards, it could be either, but leaning more towards that professional market, which is why, as cool as I think it is, it's definitely not a camera that is designed for me. The price is $5,500 USD, so it is about $1,300 more expensive than the FX3 at the moment, which crazy enough, the FX3 now is more expensive than when I bought mine 5 years ago. So it's more expensive. For what it does, I think this is actually an okay price. I guess if you get the body only, it would be cheaper. It would go down to $48.99 for just the body only. The XLR handle, I think, is absolutely worth it. That is part of why the FX3 has been such a crucial part of my workflow, is being able to run XLR audio directly into the camera. Although I will say, I don't think they've changed this on the FX5. The FX3's top handle only goes to here, and it is very plasticky. So it's a little bit small and a little bit plasticky. I added this metal part here. This is a Condor blue like extension that gives you some mounting points, and then, another cold shoe on the back. And this adds some length and rigidity to the top handle that it really should just be like this from the factory, but it's not. So the build quality of the top handle is not like perfect, but it's okay. The thing is, let's see if we can find some of these photos. What I do really love about the top handle are the physical controls, and the FX5 has those and takes them even further. And if we look at the other side, we've got the dual XLR inputs, and then we also have controls for inputs 1 and 2. And to me, it is these physical controls that like make me not as super excited about 32-bit float. 32-bit's cool, but I think sometimes people over-rely on it. I like using it in situations where it is something like, if I'm using one of these small wireless mics and you want 32-bit float recording for backup, if I'm using a cheap, simple recorder like this and I just don't have time to like think about dialing in the levels perfectly and I just need to record something, I think it's great for that. And, if you're using a camera like this to do a lot of live events and a lot of run and gun stuff and journalism type things, 32-bit float can build in a lot of flexibility. But the fact that you do have all of these physical controls, that lets you dial in things correctly while you're recording. And I think that that is something worth taking the time to do. And then using 32-bit float, essentially as like an emergency recovery thing if needed. That's just kind of my opinion. It's a cool thing to have, but especially when you have this much flexibility with physical controls and the ability to just dial things in, literally using dials, you might as well just get it right in camera rather than relying on 32-bit float. But as we're going through and looking at some of these photos, especially with how the FX5 differs from the FX3, the side over here, there's definitely quite a few differences. So we still have full-size HDMI, which I have here, but we also have now an Ethernet port, so a lot more connectivity, it's hard to say that word, connectivity, than I have on the FX3 here, which for my workflow doesn't really matter, but just worth noting. Now we do have plug-in power plus dual USB-C. So this has I don't think I've ever even used this micro USB port here. USB-C, I use this for power all the time, but you now have a dedicated plug-in power port, which is very, very cool because this does also use Sony's newer batteries. Everything, so many Sony cameras have used these little batteries, where these are the Z100s. Yeah, these little batteries have been around in Sony cameras for many, many years. And was it the A7R6 and the FX5 using newer batteries that are higher capacity? So total pain when you change your battery ecosystem. I love that I can swap batteries between all three of my Sony cameras, but I also understand everything this camera can do. Maybe it needs a little more power because good battery life is very, very important. We also now have the headphone and the mic jack on the outside without needing to open a little door. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. And you have the vent for the internal fan. I've never had my A7S3 overheat ever, or my A7V or even my A7IV when I had that. But having the fan in here, especially, what is the temperature today? Here is the 7-day forecast for where I live, and this is actually cooler than it's been lately. So overheating is a very real concern with cameras, and having the built-in fan is something I am a fan of because you never have to worry about overheating. The front of the camera looks basically identical to the FX3, FX2, FX3A, FX30, except for the bigger sensor. The back of the camera, we have a lot of changes, which, I don't know, we have buttons in different places. Oh, let me rant for a second. Oh my God, after owning both these cameras for 5 years, the positioning of these two buttons, this is the mode button and the menu button, drives me insane because on Sony's other cameras, the menu button, they're like traditional style mirrorless cameras. The menu button is on the left. On the FX3, it's on the right. That is so confusing. Anyway, you can see the screen is significantly bigger. We don't have the dial back here, but we do have some other, buttons and things. And I didn't mention, I don't know if they'll show photos of it, but this does have a different interface and a different operating system than the FX3, so it's much more in line with the Burano and the Venice and the higher-end cinema cameras. The top-down shot of the camera, very similar to the FX3 in a lot of ways, except this little thing right here, this is why I'll never be able to use that super cool viewfinder with the FX3, because it doesn't just go in the hot shoe like the Blackmagic viewfinder does. It actually needs this little port here. I think this photo will show it. This little port here is important because it allows that viewfinder to connect and slot in there. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that external thing will ever be available for the other FX cameras, even though I really wish it was. The card slot side of the camera looks basically exactly the same as mine. You have your dual card slots. The bottom of the camera is a little different, and I did see a note. Mine's in a Tilta cage. I really like this because it has the camcorder grip handle, which is just so handy. The bottom of this camera, though, the mounts are in different points, and the camera itself is a different size. So if you do have one of the existing FX cameras, cages and stuff likely won't fit on there. And you can touch the screen. So that's a feature right there. You can take a big old finger and just touch the screen while the display is turned off. That's the best feature. A couple other just interesting and or kind of weird things about the camera. The FX5 does not have a dedicated photo mode. So the FX3, even though it literally says cinema line right here, it does have a dedicated photo mode. So you can take 12 megapixel still photos. It's got all those features right there. That's one of the things the mode button lets you switch between. The FX5 is just a video camera, much like the FX6, FX9, those cameras were too. The other thing about it is the fact that it does have stabilization, which is supposed to be better than these cameras. And, at the time, the stabilization in these cameras was the best I've ever seen. But in the years since, that's definitely an area where technology has improved a lot. Like the AI autofocus is better now than the autofocus in these cameras, but the autofocus in these cameras is still amazing. Image stabilization is where I feel like there's a big improvement, because if you've used the FX3 or the A7S3 and you turn on active stabilization, the amount of wobble and stuff is very distracting, and it's something I've essentially learned not to use. If I need to use stabilization, I use the lowest level, and then I add some in editing afterwards. So the stabilization of the FX5 significantly better than the FX3, but you can also just get rid of it, which is interesting. This is, it's designed for maybe not individual owners, but also like production houses and things to buy, because you can pay extra money to remove a feature permanently. If you want to have the image stabilization on the FX5 just taken away forever, you can send it in and they'll do that. You can pay them money to take away that feature and you can never get it back. And this, I think, just has to do with, again, making the FX5 fall in line with those higher end cinema cameras, which do not have stabilization. And I think the big reason, because it's confusing, I was like, why can't you just turn off the stabilization? Why would you need to actually take it out so the sensor is locked in place? And I think it has to do with probably maybe some of like the higher end mounts and lenses and things that get put on those higher end cameras, but also open gate. Maybe this is just my thoughts here, because if you're using, when you use stabilization, it crops in on the sensor. And if you're using open gate, then there's no room to crop in. So if you're primarily shooting open gate at like the 5K resolution and the sensor, I don't know if there's just little bits of wobble depending on what you're doing, because the sensor is capable of moving even though the stabilization is turned off, then locking that in place, especially for open gate workflows, might make a lot of sense. I'm sure there are other reasons for it too. That was just the one that kind of popped into my mind there. So that is a very interesting feature to remove features. But again, I think this goes to that split of this camera is primarily intended for more professional use, but if you want to use it, for more consumer, prosumer, or high-end, individual production type stuff, client work, those kinds of things, it'll work for that workflow as well. So like, I would love stabilization. I want stabilization in all my cameras. I want better stabilization, more stabilization. Whereas someone who's working on a super pro workflow is like, absolutely, I don't want that. The thing I think is strange though, is a lot of people have said that you can't have stabilization and ND filters. So like, if you want internal ND filters like those higher end cinema cameras have, you can't have stabilization because now the sensor's moving behind the filter and it's this weird thing, and the systems just don't really work well together. And they also take, like, there's very little space in these cameras. So that made sense, except there's no option for like internal NDs or anything. So that doesn't exist here. So you just lose, I don't know. It's, again, this is why I'm interested in this camera. It's a really fun camera, but it's definitely not a camera for me. And that kind of goes with price. Like I mentioned, the FX3 being the most expensive camera I ever had, probably not a camera I need. I'm sure I could do a lot of what I do with the ZV-E10, like I don't necessarily need this, but it does make my life easier. And when you use a tool on a near daily basis, all of those little things really do add up over time. But going beyond this is just not something I would ever need. I just want to put that out there because, it's very easy when new things come out for people to feel like what they have isn't good anymore. I have no desire to upgrade these cameras, right? Like, these are old cameras now and they're still fantastic and they do everything I want to do. So I just want to point out and remind you that the thing you've had for a long time that's been working really well still works as good as it ever did. That doesn't change just because something new came out, but it is always fun when something new comes out. And now when there are more options for more people and more workflows, I think that's always a fun and overall a good thing.